There's a moment in every person's life when they stand at a crossroads between who they are and who they could become. Most of us assume we choose correctly, that our morals are fixed, that our sense of right and wrong is permanent. But what if everything you believe about your own goodness is an illusion? What if the distance between a decent person and a monster is not a vast chasm, but a single step? And what if you've already taken it without realizing? In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo turned the basement of Stanford University's psychology building into a makeshift prison. He recruited 24 male college students, all carefully screened for psychological stability and good character. These were not troubled young men. They were ordinary, well-adjusted individuals who had no history of violence or antisocial behavior. Zimbardo randomly assigned half of them to play guards and half to play prisoners. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It lasted 6 days. Within hours of the experiment beginning, the guards started stripping prisoners, forcing them into humiliating positions, denying them basic dignity. Within days, they were waking prisoners in the middle of the night for count, making them do push-ups until they collapsed, placing them in solitary confinement for minor infractions. One prisoner had a complete emotional breakdown and had to be released early. Another developed a psychosomatic rash that covered his body. The guards, meanwhile, seemed to enjoy their power. They invented new punishments. They escalated their cruelty. They were not ordered to do any of this. They simply did it because the situation allowed them to. When Zimbardo finally shut down the experiment, he had to confront a disturbing reality. He had not discovered something about prisons or authority. He had discovered something about human nature itself. And what he discovered was that morality is not a fixed trait. It is a fragile construction that collapses under the right conditions. We grow up believing that people are fundamentally either good or bad, that those categories are stable, and that most of us belong firmly in the good column. We tell ourselves that we would never hurt someone without cause, that we would never abuse power, that we would never participate in something we knew was wrong. This belief is comforting. It allows us to navigate the world with a sense of moral certainty, but is also dangerously naive, because the truth that psychology has revealed again and again over the past century is that moral character is not an inherent quality. It is a performance that depends heavily on context. And when the context changes, the performance changes with it. The Stanford prison experiment became one of the most famous studies in psychology. But it was not the first time researchers had demonstrated how quickly ordinary people could abandon their moral foundations. 20 years before Zimbardo's prison, Solomon Asch conducted a series of experiments on conformity that revealed something equally unsettling. Asch gathered groups of participants and showed them a simple task. They were presented with a line and then asked to identify which of 3 other lines matched its length. The correct answer was obvious. A child could do it. But Asch had planted actors in each group who were instructed to give the wrong answer. The real participant, surrounded by people confidently stating something that was clearly false, faced a choice: trust their own perception or conform to the group. 75% of participants conformed at least once, giving an answer they knew was incorrect, simply because everyone else was saying it. Some conformed repeatedly, overriding their own senses to maintain social harmony. Asch's experiments demonstrated that people will deny objective reality to avoid standing out, to avoid conflict, to maintain their place within the group. If people will abandon truth for acceptance, what else will they abandon? This is where moral collapse begins, not with a dramatic transformation, not with a sudden abandonment of all principles, but with small compromises, tiny adjustments to accommodate. Social pressure. You tell a small lie to fit in. You laugh at a joke you find offensive because everyone else is laughing. You go along with a decision you disagree with because speaking up would be uncomfortable. Each compromise seems insignificant. In isolation, but they accumulate. They establish a pattern, and that pattern shapes who you become. The psychologist Dan Ariely has spent decades studying dishonesty, and one of his most consistent findings is that people don't make a conscious decision to become unethical. They slide into it gradually through a process he calls the slippery slope of dishonesty. In his experiments, when people are given opportunities to cheat in small ways, they often take them. They fudge numbers slightly. They round up in their favor. They tell themselves it doesn't really matter because the amount is trivial. But once they've crossed that line once, crossing it again becomes easier. The internal resistance weakens. The rationalization becomes automatic. And over time, the behavior that once required justification becomes normal. What makes this process so dangerous is that it operates below conscious awareness. You don't wake up one day and decide to abandon your morals. You simply adjust them incrementally to accommodate the situation you're in. Psychologists call this moral disengagement, but that term makes it sound like a deliberate choice, when in reality, it's more like a gradual erosion. Albert Bandura identified several mechanisms through which this erosion occurs. One is moral justification, where harmful behavior is reframed as serving a higher purpose. Soldiers commit atrocities in the name of national security. Executives justify exploiting workers as necessary for economic growth. Parents abuse their children under the guise of discipline. The harm is real, but the justification provides cover, allowing the person to maintain their self-image as moral even as they do immoral things. Another mechanism is advantageous comparison, where you minimize your own wrongdoing by comparing it to something worse. Yes, you're lying to your customers, but at least you're not stealing from them outright. Yes, you're enabling abuse, but at least you're not the one committing it. The comparison is irrelevant to the actual morality of your actions, but it serves its psychological purpose. It protects you from guilt. Perhaps the most insidious mechanism is the gradual displacement of responsibility. When you are part of a system, part of a hierarchy, part of a collective enterprise, it becomes easy to tell yourself that you are not personally accountable for the outcomes. You are just following orders. You were just doing your job. You were just one person in a much larger machine. This is the logic that allowed ordinary Germans to participate in the Holocaust, ordinary Americans to participate in slavery, ordinary people throughout history to participate in atrocities, while maintaining that they themselves were not to blame. The diffusion of responsibility is so powerful that it can override almost any moral objection. In Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, participants administered what they believed were painful and potentially lethal electric shocks to another person simply because an authority figure told them to continue. They expressed discomfort. They questioned whether they should proceed. But when the experimenter calmly insisted, most of them obeyed. The presence of an authority figure who took responsibility allowed participants to surrender their own moral agency. They became instruments of someone else's will. And in doing so, they absolved themselves of the need to make moral judgments. But moral collapse does not require an authority figure explicitly giving orders. Sometimes the situation itself provides the structure that facilitates disengagement. The Stanford prison experiment is the clearest example of this. Zimbardo did not tell the guards to be cruel. He simply created an environment where cruelty was possible, where the normal social constraints were removed, where the guards had absolute power and the prisoners had none. The situation did the rest. The guards adopted their roles with disturbing enthusiasm because the role gave them permission to act in ways that would normally be unthinkable. They were not being themselves. They were being guards. And guards, as they understood the role, were supposed to be tough, dominant, and controlling. The prison became a stage where they could perform a version of themselves unconstrained by the usual rules of decency, and they performed it with increasing intensity. As the days went on, this reveals something critical about human psychology. We are not consistent across contexts. The person you are at home with, your family, is not the same person you are at work. The person you are with your friends is not the same person you are with strangers. We contain multitudes, and which version of ourselves emerges depends on the social role we are occupying and the expectations attached to that role. This is not hypocrisy. It is the fundamental nature of human identity. We are actors who internalize our roles so completely that we forget we are acting. And some roles bring out the worst in us. When you give someone power without accountability, when you place them in a position where cruelty is not only permitted but expected, when you surround them with others who are behaving cruelly, they will often become cruel, not because they are inherently evil, but because the situation has activated a version of themselves that is capable of evil. The psychologist Robert J. Lifton studied Nazi doctors who worked in concentration camps, trying to understand how physicians who had taken an oath to do no harm could participate in genocide. What he found was a process he called doubling, where individuals developed two separate selves. There was the self who was a caring doctor, a loving father, a cultured human being. And there was the self who worked in the camp, who selected people for the gas chambers, who conducted grotesque medical experiments. These were not entirely separate personalities. They were adaptations, compartmentalized identities that allowed the individual to function in radically different moral universes without experiencing the psychological dissonance that should have torn them apart. The camp self operated according to the logic of the camp. It accepted premises that the normal self would find abhorrent, and because the two selves remained partially separated, the person could go home at night, play with their children, listen to music, and never fully confront the horror of what they had done during the day. This capacity for compartmentalization exists in all of us. We do it in smaller ways all the time. We separate our professional ethics from our personal ethics. We maintain different standards of honesty depending on who we're talking to. We adjust our behavior to fit the environment we're in. Most of the time, this flexibility is harmless, even adaptive. It allows us to navigate complex social worlds. But it also means that we are always capable of more than we think we are, both good and bad. The person who would never lie to a friend might lie habitually to a customer. The person who would never steal from a neighbor might steal from their employer. The person who would never harm someone in their community might harm someone they've been taught to see as an outsider. The moral boundaries we think are fixed are actually permeable, and they shift depending on how we define the situation and who we define as deserving of moral consideration. This brings us to one of the darkest aspects of moral collapse, the process of dehumanization. When you strip someone of their humanity, when you stop seeing them as a person with thoughts and feelings and rights, it becomes dramatically easier to harm them. This is not a metaphor. Brain imaging studies have shown that when people view outgroup members, especially those they've been conditioned to hate or fear, the regions of the brain associated with empathy and social cognition show reduced activity. The person is literally processing the other as less than fully human. And once that shift occurs, moral rules that normally apply simply don't. You wouldn't torture a person, but you might torture a terrorist. You wouldn't enslave a person, but you might enslave someone you define as property. You wouldn't genocide a people, but you might exterminate a threat. The language changes, the categorization changes, and suddenly acts that would be unthinkable become not only thinkable, but justified. Every major atrocity in history has relied on this mechanism. The Nazis called Jews vermin and subhuman. The Hutus called Tutsis cockroaches. American slaveholders constructed an entire pseudoscientific framework to justify treating black people as less than human. The language was not incidental. It was essential. It provided the cognitive architecture that allowed ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty without seeing themselves as cruel. They were not harming people. They were eliminating a threat, purifying the race, maintaining order. The harm was real, but the perception of the harm was distorted by the dehumanizing framework. And that framework was not imposed from outside. It was internalized, accepted, and reproduced by millions of individuals who needed to believe that what they were doing was right. This is the terrifying efficiency of moral collapse. It does not require monsters. It requires ordinary people placed in situations that activate their capacity for cruelty and then provided with justifications that allow them to maintain their self-image as good. The rest happens almost automatically. The small compromises accumulate. The rationalizations become habits. The situational pressures overwhelm the individual's resistance. And before they fully realize what has happened, they have become someone they would not have recognized a year earlier. The transformation is not dramatic. It is incremental. And that is precisely what makes it so dangerous. If becoming a monster required a sudden, conscious choice, most people would refuse. But it doesn't. It requires 1,000 small choices, each of which seems defensible. In the moment, each of which moves you slightly further from who you thought you are. The question this raises is deeply uncomfortable. If moral collapse is situational rather than dispositional, if it is something that can happen to anyone under the right conditions, then what does that mean for our understanding of ourselves? It means that the distance between you and the person who commits atrocities is not as great as you imagine. It means that your moral character is not a fixed feature, but a variable that responds to environmental pressures. It means that given the wrong job, the wrong social circle, the wrong ideology, the wrong moment of desperation, you could become someone you currently find abhorrent. This is not to say that everyone is equally likely to collapse morally or that individual differences don't matter. Some people are more resistant to situational pressures than others. Some people have stronger moral frameworks, more developed empathy, greater courage. But no one is immune. The capacity for moral collapse exists in all of us, dormant, waiting for the conditions that will activate it. So what protects against this? What keeps people from sliding down that slope? The research suggests several factors. One is moral awareness, the ability to recognize when a situation is pushing you toward unethical behavior. If you can see the mechanisms at work, if you can notice when you're starting to rationalize something you know is wrong, you have a chance to resist. This requires constant vigilance, a willingness to question your own justifications, to examine whether you're compromising principles you claim to hold. Another protective factor is accountability, both to others and to yourself. When you know your actions will be scrutinized, when you have to explain and justify them to people whose opinions you care about, you are less likely to stray. This is why transparency is such a powerful check on unethical behavior. It forces people to confront how their actions would look from the outside, and that external perspective can interrupt the internal rationalizations that make moral disengagement possible. But perhaps the most important factor is simply the willingness to acknowledge that you are vulnerable. The people most at risk for moral collapse are those who believe it could never happen to them, who are so confident in their own goodness that they stop monitoring their behavior, who assume that their intentions are enough to guarantee ethical outcomes. This confidence is dangerous. because it blinds you to the ways you are already compromising. It allows you to dismiss warning signs as irrelevant. It prevents you from seeking feedback or questioning your choices. The people who maintain their integrity in difficult situations are often those who are most uncertain about it, most worried about failing, most vigilant against the subtle ways they might be slipping. They do not trust their own goodness. They verify it constantly through reflection and correction. None of this is meant to suggest that moral responsibility is an illusion, or that people who do terrible things should be excused because the situation made them do it. Situations shape behavior, but they do not eliminate choice. Even in the Stanford prison experiment, not all guards were equally cruel. Some resisted the role. Some found ways to be decent within the constraints of the situation. The same was true in Nazi Germany, in Rwanda, in every context where atrocities occurred. There were always people who refused, who maintained their humanity, who chose resistance over compliance. The fact that moral collapse is understandable does not make it inevitable, and that distinction matters because it means we are not helpless. We can structure situations to make ethical behavior easier and unethical behavior harder. We can create cultures that reward moral courage rather than punish it. We can educate people about the mechanisms of moral disengagement so they can recognize them in themselves. We can build systems of accountability that make it difficult for individuals to harm others without consequence. These interventions work. They reduce the likelihood of moral collapse, but they require us to accept the uncomfortable premise that we are all capable of becoming what we fear. Chilling takeaway: you're not as good as you think you are. Your morality is not a permanent feature of your character. It is a fragile performance that depends on the stability of your environment, the strength of your social bonds, and the consistency of your self-reflection. Right now, in this moment, you are making small compromises that seem harmless. You are rationalizing behavior that conflicts with your values. You're participating in systems that cause harm. And you are telling yourself that your participation doesn't matter because you're just one person. But every monster in history started exactly where you are now, convinced of their own decency, certain that they would never cross the line, blind to the fact that the line was already behind them. The collapse has already begun. The only question is whether you will notice it in time to stop. If this video made you uncomfortable, that discomfort is important. Do not dismiss it. Sit with it. Examine the ways you're already compromising, the small ethical failures you have normalized, the justifications you have accepted without question. Think about the situations in your life that might be pushing you toward moral collapse. Think about whether the person you are becoming is the person you want to be. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into the psychology that shapes human behavior. Leave a comment sharing a moment when you recognize yourself slipping, or a time when you chose to resist. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the most dangerous belief you can hold is that this does not apply to you.